Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Yehuda Kagan. I lead global marketing for Ostendio and will be your host for today's session. If you're on the webinar today, there's a good chance you're looking for proven ways to reduce the risk of cybersecurity threats, and you're in for a treat today. We all understand the need to reduce the risk of a cybersecurity incident, but the challenge is, how do you quantify this risk? And more importantly, what investments should be made to reduce the risk? Fortunately, we've got two of the most renowned experts in the field today to help you resolve these questions. But before I introduce the experts, a few administrative details. We are recording this session and we'll make a replay available. We've put you all on mute, but you'll have plenty of time to ask questions during the Q&A period at the end of the webinar. Just check the bottom of the control panel to type in your questions. We'll get to as many as we can. If we don't answer your questions in this session, someone will personally reach out to you. And now to introduce our experts. Joining me today are Sanna, President of the FAIR Institute and CEO of RiskLens, and Grant Elliott, Founder and CEO at Ostendio. Good morning, gentlemen.
Yeah. Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Just a little bit about our speakers, our experts today. Grant Elliott is a preeminent thought leader in enterprise security. He speaks regularly about how organizations can implement effective cybersecurity and risk management programs. Grant is the former COO and CISO of Axiva, an integrated messaging and patient engagement platform, and he's a former business executive at AT&T as well. This has provided him with 15 years of experience developing and managing cybersecurity programs and supporting regulatory audits. Thanks for joining us today, Grant.
Great to be here.
Great. And Nick is president and founder of the FAIR Institute. The FAIR Institute is a 11,000 member expert organization dedicated to advancing the discipline of measuring and managing cybersecurity and operational risk. Nick is also the CEO at RiskLens, a leading cyber risk quantification solutions provider that helps organizations assess and manage cyber risk from the business perspective. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks for having me again.
Of course. So both Nick and Grant agreed that risk management should be more science than it is art. And today, they'll walk you through how to take a data-centric approach to demystify the process to enable more quantifiable results. So, gentlemen, without further ado, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, I really appreciate that, Yehuda. And Nick, great to be on with you again. For anyone listening today, Nick and I actually have the same investor group that can invest. We're part of the same kind of stable for Sage Venture Partners, and through that process we get introduced and we're able to quickly identify a really strong affinity between our two organizations and how we can potentially work together and collaborate. Risk management, as I'm sure everyone knows, is a kind of not as well understood a concept as people might think. Ostendio and I just published a white paper on and really kind of data-driven approach to risk management, which is the kind of driver in part for this webinar. And so I'm going to start out, we're going to kind of do this as a kind of a question and answer session. Nick has been introduced as an expert in this area, and not just in terms of the company he runs, but the institute as well, which as was mentioned has 11,000 members. So I'm going to kind of defer in many cases to his judgment as the expert in this area. And hopefully we can have a kind of lively, engaging conversation as I kind of challenge a few of those concepts as well as part of the conversation. So, Nick, I'm going to start off with just a really, really simple question, right? From your perspective, what is risk management?
Well, risk management is a set of activities that help organizations manage risk. In most cases, especially when it comes to hazard risk, minimize risk. And so, in the cyber world, a set of activities that companies implement to reduce the impact of cyber threats. And so that's the set of those activities, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned there, I mean, this is an interesting concept because people use this word risk generically, and you use the word impact there, right? And so when you kind of define or sort of quantify risk a little bit more detailed, you know, a lot of the things that we talk to our customers are the fact that, you know, a risk generically has to have two attributes. It has to have the impact that something's actually going to have, and then a likelihood that it's going to happen. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is important because risk has been treated oftentimes more of an art, that was more subject to personal judgment, and more as an implicit discipline, where people use their gut, their sentiments about a situation to incorporate, those sentiments in decision making, and in ways that is not always very defensible and justifiable. How do you break down your assumptions? If you were to build a business plan, investors want to know in detail the assumptions you're making, that are underlying the business plan. But when it comes to cyber risk, somehow we have been very fine winging it, and hoping that people would just believe us, or portraying that cybersecurity is so complex and so dynamic that it is impossible to actually properly assess risk. And so fortunately, in the last decade or so, models have emerged to allow to treat risk more of a science, versus a subjective art, where part of the equation in measuring risk and assessing risk, which is at the core of a risk management function, is this notion of frequency and impact. And so a risk is really can be defined as the probable frequency and probable impact of an event. In this case, could be a cyber threat event.
Now, we're going to get into the concept of data, but one of the things I love about your approach is, we're going to come to RiskLens in a second, but you didn't just kind of take the kind of corporate approach on its own. You put together an organization, right, called the FAIR Institute, because as you outlined here, there's a lot of debate around different perspectives on this. So tell me a little bit about the FAIR Institute. How did that come about? Why was trying to get a consensus around this important from your perspective?
Yeah, well, it first started from a real business need. I'm going to recount the experience of one of my partners. His name is Jack Jones. He used to be the CISO at Nationwide Insurance many years ago. And he found himself as a newly minted CISO in a business setting. Imagine a boardroom with a bunch of business executives. And as a new CISO, you come with your strategy and your request for money, And so he starts talking about threats and vulnerabilities, in detail. And at some point, somebody says, time out, Jack. Look at us. We are business people. We're insurance people. And we have no idea what you're talking about. We are not technologists. We only need to have two questions for you as a leader that should manage cyber risk. How much risk do we have? And if we give you those millions of dollars you're asking for your budget, how much less risk will it be for our business? Can we go about? Is that acceptable as a resulting state? And he was thinking like, wow, it's true. Those are great questions, but he didn't know how to answer. And he said, as an industry, we've done a great job in improving our technical chops, but nobody has been trained on how to assess and then manage risk, in terms of business impact. And so he went on a journey, basically developing something that became a standard ultimately called FAIR, Factor Analysis of Information Risk. It became this methodology to consistently and quantitatively measure risk. And it started having a following. And I was approached by many of the followers of FAIR, and they're asking me, Nick, we want to, adopt this model FAIR. We want to assess FAIR, but we want to learn together. We believe that sharing best practices can help accelerate the maturation of our practices. I want to know how my peers are reporting to the board. I want to know how they are justifying their investments. I want to know how they are prioritizing, their security initiatives. And so the more we get together, the more we exchange, the better it is. And so that led to the creation of the FAIR Institute, an organization whose goal is to continue to develop best practices based on the FAIR standard, and to share and accelerate development of best practices around it. And so the benefit of it is that if we can establish a common language in the industry of how risk is measured, how risk is communicated, then we resolve the communication challenge that we have between the various stakeholders in the organization, which is the business people, the security people, and audit, we can speak the same language about risk and not confused about what it is and how you measure it.
Now, you've actually created a little graphic to share here, I think, for the FAIR Institute, if you can bring it up. Maybe talk us through the specific components here, because I think it's kind of great for people to understand, you know, when we have this kind of debate about, you know, science versus art, you know, this is really starting to go into looking at this more in a kind of scientific notion.
Yes. So no, thank you for bringing that up. First of all, we want to make sure that people understand the risk is, again, the probable frequency and the probable impact of loss events. And loss events need to be defined, because a loss, especially in cyber, can be defined as, you know, the probability of a threat hitting an asset of value that might, you know, be surrounded by a certain number of controls and then resulting in a material impact onto the business. It's only when you have a probable, kind of say, loss event, you have risk. And so once you define those loss events, you know, again, defining the threat, defining the asset, and defining the potential impact, you can start measuring it. And here you have on screen a schematic depiction of how the FAIR standard helps you decompose risk. And you can see here two branches, one related to the possible frequency of a loss event, and the other branch related to possible impact. And so at the highest level, this is probably a formula that people intuitively gravitate to and saying, you know, it's likelihood times impact. We actually like to talk about frequency also more specifically in terms of likelihood, because likelihood could be a very subjective, kind of say, definition, while frequency in terms of how many times can this happen in a year, in a larger time span, is a bit more precise. And if you don't have data at that level of abstraction, because an incident may not have happened yet in your industry or in your particular company, you can derive it by working, you know, at factors lower in the model. So the beauty about FAIR is that depending on the availability of data, you can work at a higher or lower level of abstraction, either use historical data or, you know, make simulation based on estimates of subject matter experts or data that may exist in the industry.
Great.
So
So I think we're going to dig into later on just, you know, this whole concept of the kind of volume of data and this kind of, you know, how much data does an organization have. So obviously the FAIR Institute itself is kind of built as a kind of way for people to understand a common model. Tell me a little bit about RiskLens itself, because obviously, you know, you contribute to this ecosystem, and you have, you know, again, 11,000 members participating, contributing to try and hopefully create a model that is generally accepted. How does RiskLens as a commercial organization leverage that framework?
No, thank you for that question. So if you can go to the next slide, thank you. At RiskLens, what we've done is we're helping organizations scale the application of the FAIR standard to quantify and manage risk, because FAIR alone is not enough. It's a conceptual model. But how do you scale a program and start, you know, pairing up your analysis with a risk register? How do you reuse the data at scale so you don't have to collect the data every single time? How do you leverage benchmark data out of the box? You know, how do you embed automated math and produce automatically generated report? All of that, you know, requires, you know, technology support, and that's what we provide at RiskLens, a platform that allows you to, in a scalable way, answer those questions that otherwise, you know, are very difficult to answer. And questions such as how much risk you have, you know, what are my top risks, and how are we trending, and are our action having an impact, and how much, and which risk mitigations initiatives reduce risk the most, and really with the ultimate goal of enabling better decision-making at scale, you know, because ultimately the goal of risk management should be to enable better decision-making, more informed decision than just a wet finger in the air or some a gut check.
So one of the things that I find interesting about cybersecurity generally, and I think risk management kind of goes to the kind of pinnacle of this, is it's not often that I speak to someone who doesn't want to do the right things, right? When I speak to CISOs or I speak to even executives in organizations, they want to implement an effective security. And when you talk to them about things like risk management, you know, if you can get them to conceptually understand what an organization needs to do, they're all on board. The challenge is, how do you go about collecting sufficient data to make effective decisions? When I go to a lot of, and I speak in a lot of panels, there's a lot of investment in cybersecurity tools and technologies that really focus on what I call the Fortune 1000, right? The Fortune 1000 problems, because that's where a lot of the money actually is. But 99.9% of corporations in the US have less than 1,000 employees, right? So the vast majority in the growing part of organizations. So if I'm a CISO and an organization that maybe has 800 employees or 1,000 employees, and I'm listening to you talking about this, I'm saying, yeah, Nick, that's great, right? But how am I going to collect all this data?
Yeah, so I think there is a myth in the industry that says you need a lot of data to complete a risk analysis. And what we found out that most companies have more data than they could think of, and less data is required for analysis. And I'm going to use here basically a concept and basically saying the goal of risk management is not to give you always super precise data. You know, most of the decision are really hinge on reducing the level of uncertainty you have in a decision, you know? And so in some cases, just knowing that your problem is a 5-figure problem versus a 7, 8, or 9-figure problem is the key to that decision making. And so for smaller companies, working off benchmarks, industry benchmarks, and then enriching the data analysis based on benchmark with a few data points that maybe around things like how many records, you know, we are relying on, and our database holds that could be exposed, that, you know, and could be a liability in certain scenarios. Cost of downtime. A few data points go a long way if you enrich it with benchmark data to complete analysis very quickly. So we have learned that with benchmark data that is now available, which was not available just a few years ago, with the technology that automates, you know, this assessment processes, the barrier of entry to doing quantitative risk assessment has been lowered dramatically.
So the secure control framework has 50 risk templates that a partner can apply, from business continuity to physical infrastructure to environmental. You know, there's a host of different things here. You know, in the white paper we published recently, I kind of did the quick math on this around, you know, if you have 1,000 employees, if you have 1,000 assets, if you have 100 locations, etc., you end up in the situation, you apply each of these risk templates to each of those artifacts, you can end up as an organization having 60,000, 100,000, 150,000 risks that you're managing and tracking all that information. Obviously, that becomes a real challenge for an organization. Is it unrealistic to expect an organization to suddenly switch that on? Or is there maybe kind of more of, you know, I think we use the concept, this is more of a kind of journey than a destination. How do you and how does the FAIR Institute help organizations think more about the kind of long-term value of building that data resource rather than, you know, you just have to switch it on day one?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, because there is, again, this misconception that if you want to start managing risk, you need to be granular down to the end level to do a good job. And what practice has taught us is that focusing on your most critical assets and your top risk scenarios does follow the famous 80-20 rule. Usually your top 10, 20, 30, 40 risk scenarios may drive 80, 90% of your risk. The same applies in cyber. So experience has shown us when you start doing risk assessments and you do, you start assessing and sizing your top risk, it's a very fast descending curve. A few scenarios are the ones can bring your company down, and then you're going to much lower return of investment in terms of benefits for more granular risk analysis. So what I tell companies, like, focus on top-down analysis, pick up your large assets, identify the scenarios that apply to those assets, and then mitigate those, work on those first. And so and many large, even the large corporation, the small ones, adopted as a best practice. They segment their asset in terms of tiers. Let's start with our mission critical, because if you're going to do a job there, we're going to secure the enterprise in the most effective way. It's like spreading, peanut butter on a sandwich, on a piece of bread. You don't want to spread it thin and spread your resources thin. You want to apply more coverage where more is needed. And so our pragmatic approach is focus more what matters most. And so there is a way to do risk analysis quickly with a few data points with benchmarks and seeing what comes to the surface, and only doing detailed analysis where it matters most.
Now you used the expression, you mentioned the expression risk assessment, and we speak to a lot of organizations, many of our customers. Again, some of them are early in this journey of building a security program. Even the ones I find that are more sophisticated, and you start talking to them about risk management, and you go in and you find out what they're doing, you tend to find that actually they're predominantly doing what I call episodic risk assessments, right? They're doing these kind of momentary snap point assessments across their organization against different parts, rather than what I talk about as pure risk management. Talk about the difference between, from your perspective, risk management and risk assessments. And I think you're probably at that point going to start getting into the concept of implicit and explicit risk.
Yeah, I think that at the core of risk management needs to be a risk, assessment and management process, because as you said, what are we doing risk management for? And a process is a way to systematize, the measurement of risk and then the support for better decision making. And in a risk management process, typically, I think best practices, encompass, steps like identifying the risk, scoping the risk scenario, analyzing and quantifying the risk, and then deciding whether we can accept the risk or whether we should mitigate it, and then reporting on it. But how you apply this process is important, because you need to decide what kind of decisions you're going to inform. And some decisions can be very different in nature. Some may be strategic decisions, like, we have a major initiative to move certain assets or business process to the cloud. And we need to do a risk assessment for that. They may be punctual, strategic, high importance, maybe happens once a year, and that's okay. But there may be other strategic, reasons for doing risk assessment, which may be a more regular basis, like providing to your board visibility into your top risk. That may be a quarterly or monthly activity, a more regular one, another set of decision may be less strategic, more operational, is making consistent decisions on how to prioritize your security investments, or deciding which security architecture protects your organization the most. Everybody's budget is limited and the time is limited. They got to prioritize. And so having a process where on a consistent basis, on a continuous basis, you can assess which security architecture, which tooling, which processes give me the biggest bang for the buck so I can reduce risk the most, is key. And we see some companies doing on a very regular basis. A very large company may do it on a daily basis. Smaller companies do it at the pace of their investments. And then we see some companies adopting this once they get a hang of it and have a baseline of data in their platform. They apply this for more tactical, decision making, such as resolving audit findings. You get those audit findings, audit coming with a bigger list. You got to fix this, all of this, and some of the issues they raise may be real risk and some may be completely immaterial. Being able to quantify the impact of those is key to focus on what matters, and then discarding and documenting why you're not following up on other things. So the pace at which you do things, and also when to start doing risk management in an explicit way, really depends on the kind of questions you need to answer. Some of them, again, are strategic, some are operational, some are more tactical, and depends on how strong of a pressure you have and how key it is to make better decision, more cost-effective decision in that process. So if the board is starting to ask you, red, yellow, green is no longer enough, I need a better rationale. If you're getting pushback from your CFO, I don't feel good about this investment, and you're running out of arguments because your technical arguments are not sufficient. If you're starting to argue with the audit where your position is almost tenuous because they're going to shame you in front of the board, it may be a good time to consider, upping your game and considering better ways of articulating risk.
So, yeah, I'm glad you brought up the kind of board, because I think that kind of executive dialogue is a kind of an interesting perspective of the whole concept of risk management for me. And, forgive me, as a former CISO, I always empathize with the CISO's perspective on this, because, in my experience, CISOs tend to be technical. CISOs like to have technical solutions that solve problems completely. And risk management is hard for them because there's more of a subjective notion to it. As you said, as much as you want to try and get as empirical as you can, there's always going to be an element of judgment involved in it. And what I found is really interesting is that dialogue between the executive team of the CEO and the CISO, right? We see it time and time again. Organization has a major security breach, and it's not the CEO that gets fired, it's the CISO, right? even although, and I can have real empathy, you know that CISO is going in and has basically presented the technology plan, has received whatever, whether it's sufficient funding or not, and has invested in tools to basically make the organization secure. And I think the CEO typically in that situation feels that, well, we've done our job, we've given them sufficient budget, etc. I think the challenge is that the executive team don't take ownership for the risk profile, because as you mentioned earlier on, the objective here is not to get to zero risk. The objective here is to get to an acceptable risk. The objective here is to understand what is our starting risk, what is our current risk, and then what is the target risk that we can accept as an organization. And unfortunately, I find that too often you find the CISOs in there trying to basically articulate a budget based on the kind of a more emotional, or based on the last vendor that sold them some sort of great cyber tool, rather than going in there and facilitating a conversation with the executive team that basically says, okay, let's look at our overall risk posture, our overall risk profile, and then look at investment decisions that allow us to reduce this to target level. Talk about how, RiskLens, Fair Institute, how do you facilitate that dialogue to make sure that you're having a conversation with the executive team where the executive team inherits responsibility for risk?
Yeah, no, you paint, a stage, and unfortunately it's too real for too many companies, because the discussion is broken, because the board or the business doesn't understand the technicality of this. We hope that by giving the CISO money, the problem goes away, and the CISO keeps all the burden of all the consequences that may happen because of cyber events. What we've seen done when companies start to assess and quantify risk in financial terms, they can present to the business, a cyber risk in a language they get, dollars and cents. Here's how much risk we have. Is that acceptable or not? If it's not acceptable, the job of the CISO is to provide options and provide the impact of those options, again, in terms that the business can understand. Here's an option that costs X, can reduce the risk by half. Here's an option that costs Y, reduce the risk much more, but it's a more costly option, and so on. And then you present those options to the business and say, here are trade-offs. And how much and what level of risk and investment the company has a stomach for is a business decision. So this enables really, this way of making risk explicit enables this business participants to really fulfill their risk governance obligations, which is how much risk to assume and how much to invest, and take that burden off the CISO. The CISO, their option is provide, make the business understand the baseline and provide options. But then they should not take on too much responsibility because it's going to fall back on.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect to that, and this is kind of, again, not trying to, make it sound like, being part of the kind of CISO fan club, I'm trying to offload responsibility. But I actually think what it also does is basically creates more accountability for the CISO, right? Because, this is not, as we've talked about earlier on, a one-time journey, right? The CISO then has a responsibility to come back each quarter, each year, and basically say, well, look, right, we had this quantifiable risk profile. We agreed that we're going to invest this money on basically reducing our risk profile. Let's have a look at what our current risk profile actually is after those investments. And then I'm accountable for making sure that we're achieving that target risk profile, that target risk score that we said we did. And if I haven't achieved it, or and maybe I haven't achieved it because there's new threats that come in or whatever, but all of a sudden now I'm still accountable, because now I'm accountable to achieve the kind of reductions in the risk profile that I've agreed to as an executive team, but not to the point that we're getting to zero risk.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that this achieves the vision of and the mission, the necessary mission for CISO to be business aligned. Our goal is to help the CISOs to become the business aligned CISO that are really their partner. And it's almost like I like to say, their risk management program should allow the business to go as fast as they can in a most secure way. It doesn't mean totally secure way, the most secure way. It's like having good brakes and having good telemetry in your car. You can go as securely if you have those bells and whistles supporting you, versus going like and taking too much risk and then maybe crashing in and burning against the wall. And so that's the mission of the CISO, to be a business partner, and that's what I think risk quantification and better risk management can help them do.
So some of the conversation you and I have had in the past is about at what level of maturity should an organization be before they're ready to kind of embrace. And, you know, I mentioned earlier on about, we talk to lots of organizations who are maybe not even doing enough from a security investment perspective. And I sympathize with, as we've said before, the understanding of how they kind of quantify those investments, right? But, you know, one of the challenges I know you have as an organization through RiskLens is finding organizations that are, you know, at that point of maturity they want to invest this. If you're a, you know, 50 person, 100 person, 500 person organization, what are the immediate steps you can do to start building out your risk management program?
Yeah, first of all, you know, when it's the right time to do this, I would say when you start getting those questions, again, when you're getting those challenges, you know, you need to better justify your investments, you better need to do this. And so, if you're a small company, I would say first start with educating yourself about what risk is, and starting educating the rest of the organization you interact with about a common language, you know. At the FAIR Institute, being a nonprofit organization, there's a lot of learning, you know, resources that you can tap into that are good for both CISOs, their direct report, but also for business people, because speaking the same language, not confusing a threat with a, can I say, a risk, you know, or a vulnerability with a risk, etc., is the first point. Let's speak about one same language of the enterprise. Let's start doing small little steps in that direction by maybe taking a few highly visible decisions and making punctual assessments, small wins along the way, become the evidence that a better discourse, a better decision-making can become the norm in the future. So I tell companies, don't try to boil the ocean right away. Achieve small wins, build a consensus, speak the same language, and then you're gonna set the stage, you know? And so training definitely being a first step, because you're gonna be a better, I would say, advocate for change if you're well-trained yourself.
Well, one of the analogies I use, and I think, you know, this kind of story goes on a little bit, but you get the point in the end, is look, we do risk management or risk assessments every single day, right? Every time we look out the window to go for a walk, we're doing a basic risk assessment on things like weather events, right? You know, is it going to rain? And we make that assessment, right? You know, we understand what's the likelihood it's going to rain, what's the impact to me, I'm going to get wet if it do rain, and we make a determination, right, whether or not we're going to go for that walk. Now, that's kind of how I define a risk assessment. The difference between risk assessment for me and risk management is when we start planning for that event, right? So maybe we've decided, we understand we live in an environment where rain is likely. I'm from Scotland, so it happens all the time. So we now purchase an umbrella, and we have an umbrella strategically positioned by the doorway. And so we're starting getting the concept of mitigation, because now when we look out and we make our assessment, is it going to rain? Well, that's not changed. The likelihood has not changed, but the impact potentially has, because if I use my umbrella, the impact for me of getting wet is obviously less, because so I'm now into this process of risk management. Risk quantification is the interesting one here, because I think this is going to get to the tool part here. You know, 10 years ago, we didn't do risk quantification. We just did this subjective, maybe it's going to rain, maybe it's not going to rain. Today, everyone does risk quantification. Everyone picks out the mobile device, they go to the phone, and they can see it's a 30% chance it's going to rain today. And so they're starting to use a more analytical portion. Now, why are they doing that? It's not because their motivation or the situation hasn't changed. They're doing that because the tool and the technology has been presented to them. And so the way I can answer the question of why should smaller organizations start doing this is because tools like your tool, like RiskLens, tools like our tool at MyVCM, there are more tools available to people today to allow them to do that level of quantification in a much easier manner. So this is not 10 years ago. We're living in a more cyber aware environment. And I think the key thing organizations need to realize is there are better tools out here that allow them to simplify this process, to perform this process at scale, and to do things like risk quantification, like, you know, being able to provide the aggregate data that organizations like yourself provide. So in the absence of, you know, direct empirical data they might have, they can use that kind of baseline data as well.
No, right on. I think benchmark data now exists sufficiently. So if you're a small organization and you understand an incident of a certain type, how hard can it hit me? There is now empirical evidence for that in the industry. We at RiskLens will start making data available early next year. So if you're a smaller company that doesn't have the resources, you know, to build a big risk management program, but want to know how hard certain events can be, with a few data points, assess how much impact that can be for you at a higher level in specific scenarios, you're going to be able to do that without having to build up a team, without having needing to even have deep knowledge of a standard like FAIR, without having to have staff on, can I say, as part of your team. So the information available is so much more available now that Benchmark will help you get a high level understanding of the situation, and then you can grow in depth as the company grows.
And I think that goes to the point, as I said, look, I mentioned at the beginning, the kind of synergistic relationship between our companies, because if you just pop to the kind of next slide, right, what we as an organization try and do is we try and provide that baseline information to our customers. So the kind of MyVCM platform helps organizations track and manage real time all of that operational data. So everything from managing your policies and procedures through the document module, conducting these episodic risk assessments, tracking and managing all your activities. All of that data is maintained within the platform. So all the artifact information that you want to apply risks to can all be tracked. And we built a very functional risk management module that allows you to basically then apply those risks. Working with someone like you, Nick, in your kind of RiskLens, the ability to then provide that kind of quantification analysis into that kind of historic, because I know that, as you said before, one of the big challenges of RiskLens is how do you source enough data to apply the quantification to? We obviously provide that mechanism to source that data and information, and we try and do it across more than just the organization itself, because we know that risk today just doesn't sit within the organization. We've kind of built what we call the MyVCM Trust Network, so that now, if you go to the next slide, you can actually see that we actually have an understanding of the organization's overall ecosystem as well. So you can basically build your security program through our platform, and then as the slide builds, you can basically see that we actually apply that to an organization's vendors, because clearly a big part of today's risk in the kind of cloud-based world we operate in is going to be the third parties in the supply chain that you're operating in. And then we also the nice thing I think we bring to the table is we bring this partnership with a lot of these audit firms, because more and more of the cybersecurity frameworks are requiring you to do risk management effectively as part of your audit requirements. And so this is, again, fastly evolving beyond this concept of, a nice to have. You're going to struggle to pass your security audits, whether you're doing a SOC 2, whether you're doing high trust, whether you're doing, especially a lot of the kind of federal audits like FedRAMP. You have to be demonstrating that you're performing some level of risk management. And to my weather analogy earlier on, there are tools here available today that allow you to do that in a much more less laborious manner. I mean, the days of two-dimensional risk registers, right, on a spreadsheet, right, you don't have to use them today. They're not going to get you based on the volume of data you actually need. Nick, I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm going to hand it back to you, Huda, to see whether we have any questions.
Great. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Grant. Before we jump into the Q&A, just a quick reminder that you can ask a question by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Gentlemen, we already have a few questions. Are you ready?
Please go.
Okay. First question. We are still trying to implement the foundational layers of our security program. Should we try to do risk management as part of this, or do we need to wait until we have the basics in place already?
That's a fantastic, yeah, go ahead.
There you go.
Yeah, my high level answer there being is like, as you implement those foundational elements in the program, you also need to pick your battles. Which activities as part of your security management program can be most impactful in securing the organization, If some things are completely self-evident, go with it, but if it's not self-evident, better risk assessments can help dramatically, in giving you the clarity and visibility and what matters most.
Yeah, and I just add to that, I think that an effective risk management program sits on top of an effective security program. You have to have the data and the information to basically. So one of the key things that we find with our customers, and we ask them all the time, is, have you even basically done a criticality assessment of your assets within the organization? And many organizations haven't. Too many organizations we speak to focus predominantly on the production data without understanding the broader ecosystem of data. Organizations use Zoom, they use Slack, they use CRM systems, and you'll be amazing how much sensitive data kind of gets pushed through those channels that organizations aren't taking into account. So it's hard for you to basically do or run an effective risk management program if you haven't you don't understand the landscape of those threats. So, you should be doing a data assessment, of all your assets, doing a criticality assessment to begin with. And then once you've done that asset criticality assessment and defined that population of people, assets, locations, etc., then you can start thinking about applying, as Nick says, doing a risk assessment is the first step, and then start doing multiple risk assessments and mitigating, and you're going to start naturally finding yourself doing risk management.
Yeah. Thank you. On that note, we have another question saying, I've tried to put together a risk register based on the assets in the organization, but I'm finding it difficult to tie this into the process that supports those assets. And the question is, should I be assigning risk to the asset itself or the process that supports the asset?
Let me start on this one, and then that you can jump on. I think it's a great question. I think that's probably the number one challenge that when I talk to organizations who are trying to build a risk management program out, is down to, I mentioned earlier on about potentially how many risks you can actually create. And if you try and duplicate risks off of assets, especially when, I think there's some statistic that says an average organization has a minimum of 172 vendors. Let alone how many systems and databases and cloud-based services you actually have as well. So I think most organizations are probably going to start building the risk program on the processes, because a process can accommodate different elements of your assets, etc., and it just becomes a simpler way to do it. And then as you mature, you can associate and then duplicate a lot of those risks against the different asset components as well. But a lot of the time it's going to come down to you as an organization, how much time you're willing to invest in this. So again, if you want to simplify it with simplified processes, I would do it on your critical processes, and then as you become more mature, apply it to your critical assets. But if you're large enough and you have the resources, then you can definitely apply it to your critical assets straight away, because fundamentally that's where your data is.
Great, thank you. Nick, do you want to chime in on that?
I think you responded so well that I don't have anything to add to that.
Okay, great. So we'll move on to another question. The question is, how do you apply your FAIR state creed to resilience and service management risks? So not necessarily cyber risks, but to resilience and service management risks.
Oh, that's a great question. We just had a FAIR conference that whose title is, managing risk and achieving resilience. And I'm going to put it in context. First of all, FAIR is a risk quantification methodology that can be applied beyond cyber. It's not tied to cyber necessarily. So there's nothing about the construct of FAIR that tied to cyber. We see many organizations adopt it as a unified model across both cybersecurity and other operational risk management disciplines. And actually, many of our customers were actually further advanced in managing and assessing risk on the cyber side, and on the operational side, they unified. And so, and you can see FAIR applied to a situation as varied as, trying to assess the risk of an active shooter situation in a hospital, assessing the risk of a kidnapping of CEO, so not just a cyber event. So that's one part of the answer. When it comes to resilience, I think that speaks to the ultimate goal of risk management. The ultimate goal of risk management is to allow us to make better decisions, to make the business more resilient in the face of changing, business conditions, in the face of, in this case, in cyber, emerging threats. And so I would say resilience is a goal. Always tie risk management, not just to answer the question, how much risk we have, but then finish the work by saying, what can we do from the risk management perspective to be more resilient? So don't just show up at the door with a problem, show up a solution that actually has a business impact and allows the company to be more resilient. That makes you a business partner. Great,
thank you. It's a great answer. One more question. I think we have time for one last question. And the question is, how does RiskLens and how does Ostendio, my VCM platform, how do they work together to help an organization? Like, what's the symbiotic relationship between the two?
Yeah, I'm gonna probably echo what Grant said before, because he portrayed it well. I think that if you understand your customer and you're progressively building your program, cybersecurity program with Ostendio and collecting data, you're gonna have, before you know it, a lot of data ready available to complete analysis in no time. And so, if you can put together the analytics capabilities, the quantification capabilities for risk of RiskLens, and fed by quality data that is being collected and managed by the Ostendio platform, you're going to be there in accelerated fashion.
Yeah, and I think I'll add from my perspective as well. Look, we get asked this question a lot, which is when I'm trying to articulate the impact of something happening, how do I make that determination, right? And in the absence of any other data, people are just guessing. Now, look, we talk a lot about volume of data, and you can take out a lot of inaccuracy if you just have a large enough sample of data, right? If you're consistently trying to be consistent in terms of how you assign impact, how you assign the remediation aspects, and you do that consistent over a long period of time with a large data set, then we talk a lot about the fact that really what you're trying to do is understand the baseline and the trend as much as the absolute. Absolute risk in its own doesn't mean a huge amount. It's more about what is the trend level, sort of, is that risk going up, is it going down, and how are we impacting it? But really kind of what RiskLens do is they take some of that guesswork, a lot of that guesswork out. They've basically been able to pull in a lot of external data so that instead of you having to guess, as I said, what is the likelihood of it's going to rain, they've got a weather app, right? That basically tells you it's a 32% chance of rain, right? So you don't have to look outside anymore and look at the clouds in the sky and make your own guess. They have the source information that allows you to control that information. And if you apply that at scale, that's incredibly valuable because you can apply that and pull that in over the course of time, and it just makes your whole program much more accurate because it's based on experiential data.
Great, thank you. So in closing, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We hope you found this session valuable. I know I did. The replay will be available in the next few days, and we'll share that when it's posted. If in the meantime you have a follow-up question, please feel free to email myself, Yehuda, at ykagan@ostendio.com. That's YCAGEN@OSTENDIO.com. Or you can connect with Grant or myself or Nick on LinkedIn, and we'd be happy to address your questions. But thank you both, Grant and Nick, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Very much enjoyed it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you.